This is Unit 5, Part 4.
We talked about oxygen being carried by hemoglobin in the blood, and we discussed at length the oxygen hemoglobin dissociation curve. So now let's talk about transport of carbon dioxide. As you know, carbon dioxide is produced in cells due to the oxidation of carbohydrates during the production of energy via aerobic respiration. So it's a byproduct, a waste metabolic byproduct of aerobic respiration. It is produced in cells and releases by diffusing out of the cell and into the bloodstream, and it gets transported in the blood in three forms. Small amount is dissolved directly in the plasma. Some is bound to hemoglobin. That's about 20% of it. And when hemoglobin does have CO2 bound to it, it technically can be called carbaminohemoglobin. But the vast majority of it exists in the form of bicarbonate, is converted into the form of bicarbonate, and is transported in the plasma. So 70% of it is converted into bicarbonate and gets transported in the plasma. And that occurs due to the following chemical reaction, which is listed at the bottom of the page here, of this slide here. And you really need to know this equation and understand it and be comfortable with it. So, carbon dioxide will combine with water. It actually diffuses into red blood cells and will combine with water in red blood cells. It doesn't combine with water. It undergoes a reaction together with water, and the reaction, the biochemical reaction, is catalyzed by the enzyme carbonic anhydrase inside red blood cells. And this produces, the product of the reaction is carbonic acid, H2CO3. Now H2CO3 is not stable. It will dissociate into hydrogen ions and bicarbonate ions. And of course, as you can see here, this is the reaction going from carbon dioxide to the final products, hydrogen ion and bicarbonate. That's the reason why the more carbon dioxide there is, the more the concentration of hydrogen ions goes up, and therefore the lower the pH. So this is a reaction that you need to know, and we're going to talk about it extensively, and we're going to talk about it again when we do renal metabolism, which I believe we do in this course. And so you need to be real comfortable with it. Carbon dioxide and water goes to form carbonic acid as a result of the action of the enzyme carbonic anhydrase, and then dissociates into hydrogen ions and bicarbonate ions. And notice the arrows are all going in both directions because the reaction is reversible. And here you see it drawn. Here we're in the tissues. There's a cell, some sort of cell in the tissues that is producing carbon dioxide, and the carbon dioxide diffuses across into the capillary, goes into the plasma, and the vast majority of it would travel into the red cells, and under the action of carbonic anhydrase produce carbonic acid. I'm going to change color. Let's see here. Carbonic acid, and then that dissociates into bicarbonate, and the bicarbonate will move out of the cell and into the plasma. And that's why we said that 70% is carried as CO2 is carried as bicarb, and it's in the plasma. At the same time, hydrogen ions are produced. Hydrogen ions will tend to some can bind to hemoglobin molecules, but it's not that important. You have hydrogen ions present. As I said earlier, about 20% of the carbon dioxide is bound to hemoglobin, and about 7 to 10% is dissolved directly in plasma. You can see that this kind of chemical reaction of carbon dioxide going towards carbonic acid and then is occurring directly in the plasma, but very, very slowly compared to inside the red cell, where it's sped up tremendously, thousands and thousands of fold faster by the enzyme carbonic anhydrase. Anyhow, this is what is happening. At the same time, of course, the red cell has delivered oxygen and has come into the surrounding PO2 of 40 in the tissues, and therefore releases the oxygen, part of the oxygen it's carrying. If you're at rest, usually about 25% of the oxygen that it's carrying gets released and diffuses out and goes into the cells, where it's used for aerobic respiration. That's at the tissue level, and the bicarbonate that is produced in the red cells diffuses into the plasma and then gets carried through the plasma. It has an important role actually in the plasma. It acts as a buffer. It tends to reduce any big changes in pH. pH has to be under very tight control in the blood plasma. It has to remain at 7.4 plus or minus 0.05 in order for normal biochemical metabolism to occur. Now, at the lungs, all the processes that I just described are acting in reverse. The bicarb moves out of the moves from the plasma back into the red cells, binds with hydrogen ions, and goes to form carbonic acid spontaneously, and then that is acted on by the enzyme carbonic anhydrase to produce CO2 and H2O, and the CO2 diffuses out from the blood and goes into the alveoli. So the whole thing goes in reverse right here. Change color. Happens in reverse here, and goes. Remember that the capillary is lined with endothelial cells. There's an endothelial cell forming part of the wall of the, and there's endothelial cells all around the wall of the capillary. And here is a type 1 epithelial cell, alveolar, in the alveolar wall, and there's the alveolar space. And the CO2 travels essentially from the plasma, where it's in the form of bicarb, into the space of the alveolus as CO2, and then gets breathed out. Meanwhile, oxygen is getting picked up by hemoglobin and associates with the hemoglobin, and the red cell goes off back to the heart and then gets pumped around the body to deliver oxygen to the tissues in the systemic circulatory capillary beds. Okay, there is a important physiological effect on the amount of carbon dioxide that can be transported by hemoglobin, which is determined by the surrounding PO2. I remind you that PO2 is important for hemoglobin carrying oxygen. If the PO2 surrounding the blood, red cells, or hemoglobin is lower, then hemoglobin releases its oxygen. If it's higher, then it takes up oxygen. For carbon dioxide, there is a physiological effect called the Haldane effect. And in this case, the lower the PO2, and remember with lower PO2, you also have lower saturation of hemoglobin with oxygen. It releases its oxygen. But the lower the PO2, the more carbon dioxide can be carried by the blood, and by the hemoglobin in the blood. And the higher the PO2, and therefore the higher saturation of hemoglobin with oxygen is, then less CO2 can be carried. So more CO2 is carried by hemoglobin as it enters into an area in the tissues where the PO2 is lower and the PCO2 is higher. and that's because of this effect of surrounding PO2 on both oxygen saturation, as shown by the oxygen hemoglobin dissociation curve, and the Haldane effect, in which this lower PO2 allows the hemoglobin to carry more CO2. It makes physiological sense that when you have a lower PO2 environment, then more oxygen is released and more CO2 should be taken up, because that's exactly where you need oxygen, and that's exactly where you usually have more CO2. And here you see in fact, the hemoglobin can carry more CO2, therefore, in the deoxygenated state than the oxygenated state. And here, this just reviews what I was just saying. At the tissue level, more CO2 is entering into the blood. More O2 is dissociating from hemoglobin due to the Bohr effect. Remember, with more CO2, you have a lower pH, a higher hydrogen ion concentration. So more O2 dissociates due to the Bohr effect. And due to the Haldane effect, more CO2 can combine with the hemoglobin, and therefore more bicarb ions can form. And when you get to the up into the lungs, the whole situation is reversed. In the lungs, there's a high PO2 environment, therefore more O2 gets picked up, and more CO2 is released. So here you see this never happens, by the way, zero saturation. This is oxygen, I'm sorry, this is CO2 saturation, or CO2 content along this axis, and this is PCO2. So with a high oxygen saturation, in this case, the blood CO2 content rises as the PCO2 is rising. Okay, so as you're going from this in this direction, PCO2 is rising. There's more blood CO2 there's more CO2 in the blood that rises. However, if there is less oxygen surrounding and in that attached to the hemoglobin, zero saturation, saturation is referring to oxygen, then even more CO2 can bind into the blood to the hemoglobin. Okay. This, I just wanted to point out to you something important that I talked about it a little bit more before, but again, when you have more CO2, and you do have more CO2 in the tissues, as particularly tissues that are metabolically active, like muscle tissue that's actively contracting and relaxing and using up a lot of carbohydrates, oxidation of carbohydrates generating a lot of energy, you'll generate a lot of CO2. So the more CO2 there is, then the equation is running this way, and there is more hydrogen ions. In other words, the pH is dropping in that kind of environment. The bicarb that's produced moves out into the plasma to help act as a buffer. So the carbonic acid bicarb buffer system resists blood pH changes. So even though you're getting accumulation of hydrogen ions, the pH is not going to change that much due to the buffering action of bicarb ions. And that's what's said here. If hydrogen ion concentration in the blood rises, excess hydrogen ions can be removed by combination with the bicarb. And if they drop, then more carbonic acid dissociates into hydrogen ions and bicarb releasing hydrogen ions. So the pH is kept in quite tight balance nicely and buffered nicely by this shifting back and forth between carbonic acid and bicarb. I would point out to you that just in basic a basic feature of biochemical reactions is that when the components of when the reactants involved in a biochemical reaction are building up in higher concentrations, then that drives the reaction to go forward away from and convert those reactants to the product. So if CO2 is building up in concentration, if you have higher amounts of CO2, then what you're going to get is that the reaction will go in this direction. At the same time, if things change and you have a higher level of hydrogen ions, and that becomes in excess, then the reaction will go in the opposite direction. Okay? Or bicarb, hydrogen ions together with hydrogen ions, then the reaction will go in the opposite direction. That's how chemical reactions are driven, and I'll refer to that later, just to give you a hint of, an example of when that might happen. You should hopefully understand that if a person is hyperventilating, they're ventilating their lungs, the gas in their lungs in and out very fast, then they're going to very rapidly blow off a lot of their carbon dioxide. And with a lower amount of carbon dioxide in the lungs, what you get is the reaction, and they're going to be blowing it off from their bloodstream, right? So what you get is that the reaction will have higher reactant concentrations on this side of the reaction because the CO2 is getting low, and this will drive the reaction this way. And therefore, a person who is hyperventilating, their pH, because they're depleting the hydrogen ion concentration in their blood, their pH will in fact rise. Okay? And that's why hyperventilation quickly can cause a problem, a metabolic problem for them, and they'll even faint from it. The cure, of course, for one easy cure for hyperventilating, a person hyperventilating, is to just give them a paper bag and have them breathe in and out of the paper bag. That way, whatever carbon dioxide they breathe in the bag, they will take back in. And so they're rebreathing, pulling in more carbon dioxide. The carbon dioxide concentration will rise, and the reaction will be driven this way, causing their pH to go back to a normal level. Okay, let's go on. I hope you understood that. What is the well, this is what I was just talking about, that if you change the respiration rate, you can alter the blood pH, because you can either blow more CO2 off by raising the ventilation rate or respiratory rate, or if it slows down, you can drop cause a decrease in pH. This is a very fast-acting adjustment to changes in pH. So in fact, the respiratory system acts as a physiological buffering system in the body. It acts very quickly. If a person's pH is dropping, then they hyperventilate, they will blow off the CO2 and the hydrogen ion concentration will rise back up. Or if they slow down their breathing, then it'll go the other way. But they can't sustain that for a very long time. It's not it's a quick adjustment, a quick way of adjusting their body pH, but it can't be sustained for a long time. Let's look at where control of the respiration actually exists. There's still a lot that's not understood about it, and there is some hand waving in this. It's not very specific to which areas of the brain, but Essentially, it is known that the respiration centers, respiratory centers, are located in the brain stem, specifically in the medulla and the pons of the brain stem. The brain stem has three parts: the midbrain, the medulla, and the pons. Respiratory centers are actually in what's called the reticular formation of these two, medulla and pons, and they control rate and depth of respiration. So how fast you breathe and how deeply you breathe, or how much you take in with each breath. These respiratory centers, the ones that are present in the medulla, they're called medullary respiratory centers. There are two. One is the dorsal respiratory group, or DRG. That is the inspiratory center. It's involved in setting the pace for inspiration. It helps to excite or trigger inspiratory muscles. It sets true relaxed breathing, the normal baseline breathing rate of 12 to 15 breaths per minute, which is called eupnea. Okay, normal breathing rate at rest is called eupnea. So the DRG, which is the inspiratory center, sets that. It will be dormant during, there's less activity during expiration. So you get turning on of action potentials coming from the out of the inspiratory center, you know, depolarizations and action potentials triggering breathing, and then when you stop inhaling, when you start to breathe out, that decreases in activity. The other medullary respiratory center is called the VRG, or ventral respiratory group, and it's involved in forced inspiration and expiration. So you have eupnea, controlled by the DRG, and forced inspiration expiration controlled by the VRG, both present in the medulla. And here you see a diagram showing part of the brainstem. Here is, in this area, is the pons, and below that is the medulla. Okay. Let me just erase that. That was the pons. There's the medulla. And here you see a diagram showing the DRG, the dorsal respiratory group in the medulla, and there's the VRG, the ventral respiratory group. And notice that the dorsal respiratory group is sending signals out to inspiratory muscles, the external intercostal muscles and the diaphragm that are involved in inspiration. When they contract, they will trigger a rise, an enlargement in the volume of the thorax, lung space, pleural cavities, and therefore a drop in pressure and air goes in. And the VRG, which is involved in forced inspiration and expiration. Let me just get rid of this. The VRG, it sends signals out to also to muscles, but here you have signals being sent out to expiratory muscles, both the internal intercostal muscles and other muscles that are involved in. There's quite a few muscles. You probably know them better than I do, actually. There are quite a few other muscles that are involved in forced inspiration and expiration. I mean, your whole chest and shoulders, and I think even in your neck, there are muscles that are helping you to take in much more and release much more, which are triggered with exercise. Okay. There is also another group, a respiratory group called, present in the pons, and it was on the previous diagram. I hope we see that again. The pons, so in the pons you have the pontine respiratory group, or PRG. The pons respiratory centers, or pontine respiratory group, has an influence and can modify activity of the two medullary centers, the DRG and the VRG. Instead of you breathing in and then holding it for a second or so and then breathing out, you tend to breathe in a smoother kind of fashion. You carry out this kind of smooth tidal breathing, and that's due to the activity of the PRG, which tends to smooth out the inspiratory and expiratory transitions. It acts to continually send out some inhibitory action or signals into to the inspiratory center in the medulla, the DRG and the VRG. Okay. Now, if a person is hypoxic, that will end up causing the DRG to generate, release more, to become more active, and it will cause the DRG to generate a gasping kind of response in the person, so that person does take in air. And sometimes people who have sleep apnea, they stop breathing during their sleep. It's quite common, actually. They will soon enough, after stopping breathing for a few seconds, not long, they will gasp and then go back to normal breathing. And that's because of a signal sent out by the dorsal respiratory group in the medulla, triggering inspiration. Now, an important point to realize is that there are some compounds, drugs, that will suppress those inspiratory signals coming from the DRG. They include sleeping pills, barbiturates in other words, also opiates, morphine, or any of the opiates, morphine, heroin, some of the ones that are used clinically, can all suppress inspiratory signals coming out of the DRG. And also alcohol suppresses that. And the two together, sleeping pills and alcohol, or sleeping pills, morphine, can be a deadly combination, and the person simply doesn't breathe. They stop breathing, and the signals aren't coming out, so they're unconscious. They fall asleep, and they're intoxicated with sleeping pills, morphine, and alcohol, or either sleeping pills, morphine, or alcohol, or a combination, and they just stop breathing. They die. Okay, the depth and rate of breathing. You know, how deeply you breathe is determined by how much stimulation you put out, stimulatory signals you put out to your inspiratory respiratory muscles. So how strong a signal comes out of the respiratory centers, the medullary respiratory centers, in fact. So that's depth, and so the level of those signals coming out. The rate is determined by how long the inspiratory center is active. So if you get stronger signals coming out, you'll breathe deeper. And if you have signals coming out for a longer time, then your rate of respiration will rise. Both respiratory centers in both the pons and the medulla, so the DRG and the VRG in the medulla and the PRG in the pons are sensitive to both not only in excitatory stimuli but also inhibitory signals coming from the brain. So here you see a slide, in fact, that summarizes what I was talking about and some of the signals that the respiratory centers respond to. Here we're looking at the medullary respiratory centers. Remember that these are the DRG and the VRG, and they control inspiration, the inspiratory rate and depth of breathing. You have the key stimuli that that this area will respond to. You know, you have sensory stimuli coming in all the time, right? And these parts of your brain will receive the sensory information and then put out the appropriate signals to tissues to respond, for respiratory muscles to respond. The kind of signals that are coming in include signals from the lungs. There are stretch receptors, for example, in the lungs. If you overstretch by breathing in too deeply, you will send some negative signals, so that to reduce the depth of breathing if it's getting too stretched. Irritant receptors will cause you to breathe at a less deep also. If you're taking in irritants, irritating molecules, you have all kinds of nerve receptors. They can respond to stretch, they can respond to irritant triggering. You have receptors in your skeletal muscles and your tendons, actually, and in the joints, and not only in the muscle but in the tendons and also the joints, and these are called proprioceptors, and they are constantly sending sensory information into the brain. And if they're more active, if the muscles are getting stretched, the joints are being moved, the tendons are also being stretched, what you get are signals going in which will trigger increased respiration. You also have inside the brainstem, and that's why they're called central as opposed to peripheral, which is outside of the brain. So you also have central chemoreceptors, and these chemoreceptors can respond to CO2 and hydrogen ion levels. Remember, when CO2 is rising, you'll get increased hydrogen ion levels because of that biochemical reaction that I talked to you about. And if these are rising too much, then to a certain level higher than normal, then you will get a stimulation of breathing, so your rate and depth of breathing will rise. The response to triggers is output from the respiratory centers, so that the respiration rate rises and you blow off more of that CO2 that was detected higher. You had higher levels of CO2 in your blood, and that will trigger you to breathe deeper and faster and blow it off. You also have, outside of the brain, you have the peripheral chemoreceptors, and these you've learned about before. They include the aortic bodies in the aortic bodies here in the aorta, and also the carotid bodies in your left and right carotid arteries. They're showing one here. This would be the the left carotid artery, but there's also one on the right side. This would be this is the right subclavian. This is the right carotid artery. This would be the brachiocephalic artery here, and this is on the left. So you have the carotid body on the left and the another carotid body on the right here, and these the aortic bodies and the carotid bodies act as peripheral chemoreceptors, and they not only detect a rise in CO2 and rise in hydrogen ion concentration, but they also can respond to decreases in oxygen levels, and they will also trigger increased rate and depth. These are all positive these are all sensory information coming into the respiratory centers that trigger positive increases in rate and depth of breathing. These ones, the stretch receptor information, the irritant, will decrease rate and depth of breathing. There are other kinds of signals higher up in the brain that can have an effect on the respiratory centers. if you have sensations like pain or really strong emotional stimulus, then the hypothalamus is activated. It can be positive or negative, and trigger signals being sent to the respiratory centers to modulate your rate of breathing. Also, higher brain centers can override it all and voluntarily control your rate and depth of breathing. If I ask you to breathe deeper or more shallow or faster or slower, you can instantly override any of these and send signals from your cortex. This is the cerebral cortex, all up here in the cerebrum, and you can send signals to either speed it up or slow it down. So there are many incoming sensory, there's a lot of incoming sensory information or nerve signals coming into the respiratory centers that can affect either mostly unconsciously but also consciously your rate and depth of breathing. The fact is, even just starting to run instantly will cause an increase in rate and depth of breathing. In fact, people who aren't properly trained in longer distance running often breathe way too fast and they tire themselves out. You have to learn how to control that, slow that down. Okay. As I said, pulmonary irritants trigger a reflex. The information goes in and it slows things down. It also causes constriction of the airways. Inflation reflex, stretch receptors can also be stimulated by lung inflation and trigger inhibitory signals that will reduce, either stop the inhalation and allow expiration, or reduce the depth of breathing, and that's actually called the Herring-Brewer reflex. The higher brain centers, as I said, and I explained it earlier, can override every other influence and even trigger in an infant, or an extremely mature person with anger, they'll hold their breath unconsciously. They do it as an unconscious action due to this overriding effect. Rise in body temperature, which wasn't on the graph, the figure before, can also cause an increased respiration rate. The cortex of the cerebrum, as I told you, can override everything. You can directly control you can bypass all the medullary controls of the respiratory centers in the medulla and voluntarily hold your breath or take a deep breath or increase your breathing rate or slow it down. Okay. In terms of PCO2 and its effect on the rate and depth of breathing, changing PCO2 levels are constantly monitored by the central and peripheral chemoreceptors. If you have more CO2 in your bloodstream, it will diffuse into the cerebral spinal fluid and will end up forming carbonic acid and then dissociating to hydrogen ions, just like in the equation I talked about earlier. So that will be detected by the central chemoreceptors. I've already talked about this process when I went through the diagram with you. So central chemoreceptors in the brainstem are surrounded by that CSF, in which you have the higher CO2. They're actually, I think, responding to the change in pH due to the hydrogen ions associated with that increased PCO2 level. But the end result is that there will be an increase. It'll trigger an increased output of signals coming from the medullary respiratory centers and cause an increase in rate and depth of breathing. And that's good, because then that will blow off that excess CO2. So here you see another diagram showing actually that kind of initial stimulus. This is the variable that changes PCO2 and the effects it triggers, both in terms of central chemoreceptors and peripheral chemoreceptors. Remember, an increased arterial CO2 will cause an increase increased CO2 will cause an increase in the cerebral spinal fluid PCO2 and therefore a decrease in pH, and that will be detected by those central chemoreceptors in the medulla. And also the increased arterial PCO2 will have an effect on the peripheral chemoreceptors, the carotid bodies and the aortic bodies, and that will also trigger a response. You know, these bodies are sensory neurons that send signals back into the brain, into the central nervous system. So this is right in the brain, and this is coming from outside, from the carotid and the aortic bodies, and it affects the medullary respiratory centers, and you get increased stimulation of the respiratory muscles, the inspiratory muscles, and increased ventilation, and more of the CO2 gets exhaled, blown off, and the arterial PCO2 returns to normal and the pH returns to normal. So we're talking about an initial stimulus causing a physiological response. How is that change regulated? Well, it's detected, triggers a response in the brain, sending out a signal to the muscles, and they increase the inspiratory respiratory muscles, and they increase their activity, bringing the initial change, which was this up here, the increased arterial PCO2, back to normal levels. And that's how the whole body works. That's how the body works for many things. That's how it regulates and controls things. You have monitoring by sensory tissues, and then if some parameter gets out of the normal range, that sensory information is sent into the central nervous system, processed, and the appropriate signals go out to either some muscle or gland or something to change, well, muscles or glands to change their activity to correct or compensate. Well, with PCO2, and I gave you this example before, that hyperventilation, an increased abnormal actual depth and rate of breathing will quickly flush carbon dioxide from the brain, from the blood, sorry. Now, hyperventilation will occur properly, normally, and it's the normal response to hypercapnia. If your PCO2 level is high, then that's called hypercapnia. And with hypercapnia, it's detected and triggers increased rate and depth of breathing so that you can return to a normal CO2 and therefore hydrogen ion concentration. When you're at rest, the original stimulus is, of course, the rise in CO2 for increased ventilation, hyperventilation. But in the end, what's detected, and I mentioned this earlier, what really is detected is the rise in hydrogen ion concentration due to that rise in CO2. The opposite response, a hypoventilation, slow, shallow breathing, is usually due to abnormally low CO2 levels. And in fact, if your PCO2 level in your bloodstream is lower than normal, substantially lower than normal, you can even have apnea, which is breathing cessation, stopping and breathing, and the person will stop breathing until their PCO2 level rises to appropriate levels, so that the pH, hydrogen ion and pH level goes back to normal. Besides PCO2 and pH, the aortic and carotid bodies also chemoreceptors act as chemoreceptors, and but one of the other things that they measure also or monitor is the PO2, the arterial oxygen level. If you have a substantial, significant drop in arterial PO2, for example, a drop to 60, you will trigger increased ventilation. But the major triggering for increased ventilation or changes in ventilation rate is really PCO2 and pH, not O2. O2 has to drop quite low in the arterial blood down to 60 before it triggers a direct effect. If carbon dioxide is not removed, and that can happen with emphysema or chronic bronchitis, pulmonary disease, then unfortunately, if it's a chronic, if a person is chronically has chronic hypercapnia, high PCO2 levels, in the end, the chemoreceptors become habituated, they become unresponsive to the PCO2 levels, and in that case, it's the PO2 level that becomes the main stimulus. And that kind of situation is called hypoxic drive, where the main driving effect on the inspiratory rate of ventilation and the depth of ventilation, the respiratory drive is due to the PO2 level, because the person with chronic hypercapnia stops responding to PCO2. So when the PO2 level drops far enough, then they'll respond. Hypoxic drive. That's the driving stimulus to drive the respiration rate. Well, changes in pH, of course, as I've explained to you, can modify respiratory rates. It can not, and that normally, usually, the change is due to changes in CO2 levels. But even when the CO2 levels and the O2 levels are normal, you can get modification if the pH changes. So in a situation where there's a change in pH, even if the CO2 and O2 levels are completely normal, then that change in pH will modify respiration rate. And you'll get an increased ventilation because of that falling a drop in pH. And that's mediated always by the peripheral chemoreceptors, the aortic and in the aortic body and in the carotid bodies, in the left and right carotid arteries. So here we see a diagram looking at those peripheral chemoreceptors. There's the carotid body. This is the left carotid body, and there is I'll highlight it. There's the left carotid body, and there's the right carotid body. On the right carotid artery, and on the left, there's the left carotid artery and right carotid artery. So you have carotid bodies there, and you have aortic bodies in the aortic arch. And those are key to sensing peripheral PO2, PCO2, and pH levels. Very, very important. Monitoring, constantly sending signals. That sensory information is constantly sending information back to the brain and goes into the brain stem. You know, it's just such a fundamental basic requirement for life that that information and being able to respond to changes in PCO2 and PO2 and pH in order to stay alive, that the information goes into essentially one of the most primitive parts of the brain, which is the brain stem. That can control the person that can have their whole cerebrum destroyed, and they'll still be breathing appropriately and maintaining reasonable PO2 and PCO2 and pH, all because their brain stem is still has not been injured, and they can their inspiratory or respiratory centers are normal. A person like that who's had their whole cerebrum or damaged or non-functional is not considered alive anymore, but the body is, they won't be conscious. Certainly the body will maintain the required PO2, PCO2, and pH levels. Okay, this is the last slide of Unit 1, Part 2. In a low pH environment, which is called in a situation where the pH is low in the body, that's called acidosis, and it may be due to carbon dioxide retention, but it can also occur due to an accumulation of lactic acid or excess fatty acids and ketones in individuals with uncontrolled diabetes. These are people who are not taking medication or a proper diet, or in starvation you can get accumulation of these fatty acids and ketones, and that can lead to acidosis. So CO2 retention, accumulation of lactic acid, and it's in fact called keto. The true name of this situation, excess fatty acids and ketones, is called ketoacidosis. Well, in response to that kind of low pH, you will get the respiratory centers responding, and in an attempt to raise the pH back to a normal level, you'll get increased rate and depth of breathing. I've mentioned this before, and it can actually correct it quite quickly. However, it's very difficult to sustain that for a long time. It's exhausting.
And that's the end of Unit 5, Part 4, and the end of Unit 5 on respiratory physiology.